Kia ora. Hello, my friends and colleagues from around the world. It's a real privilege to be here with you today, and I look forward to speaking with you on this very important topic and conversing with our colleagues from the ASEAN PR network and also from the Global Alliance. My name's Catherine Arrow, and I'd like to take some time with you now to talk through some of the things that perhaps we need to consider when it comes to risk issues and crisis communication. There have been many changes over the last few months, and in this presentation, in a few moments' time, I'll really be looking at how we can find wisdom. We know a great deal about how to conduct ourselves when it comes to crisis communication, the things that we should be aware of for risks and issues. But the heart of what I'd like to speak with you about is how we can continue to engage with our stakeholders, build those relationships that are so critical to our license to operate in an operating environment that is so different to the way that it has been in the past for so many people.
So, as we negotiate the waves of crises that are surrounding us all at the moment, I'd very much like to start with some good news and introduce you to somebody very, very special. I'd like you to meet Quinn. Quinn came into the world last Wednesday and is our first grandchild. Her name is drawn from the Gaelic for wisdom, counsel, and can refer to intelligence. Looking into her beautiful eyes when they're open, there's an old soul there with wisdom yet to come, and both Quinn and her name are perfect. And it was in greeting and thinking about Quinn and wisdom that led me to re-examine the way that we approach communicating in a crisis. When we talk, as we are today, about communicating in a crisis with all of our stakeholders, employees, customers, suppliers, we have to take a step back and ask, what are we doing this for? When we think about the systems we have in place, the structures, our society, why do we do what we do? And what is it that throws us into crisis? What makes us fearful, uncertain? What makes organisations collapse as their reputations fail? In theory, we do what we do so that we can collectively live with some dignity, raise our families, treasure our relationships, be free to care for one another, to create, to serve others, to live well and meaningfully. In practice, that life is only the domain of a few. For millions around the world, lived realities are quite different, and crisis is their daily experience. Every minute is filled with risk. Every turn reveals another issue to be dealt with. We're collectively experiencing the crisis of the pandemic while simultaneously rushing headlong into economic crisis, deepening health crises, environment and societal upheavals. So when we talk about the new norm, we have to be completely honest and say the new norm is not simply a resurgence of what was once considered ordinary. It is, instead, a norm of continual crisis, likely to run until the middle of this new decade or even further. If we accept that crisis is the new norm, how do we find the wisdom to weather the turmoil, stem the flow of uncertainty, build and rebuild the relationships we need in order to operate as local, national and global societies? How are we going to provide some safety and certainty for all those young parents who've welcomed their own precious children in the last 6 months, our elders so badly affected by this particular disease, and all of us in between? How as organisations do we stay connected? Actions, as they say, speak louder than words. An effective crisis communication, inside and outside the organisation, begins long before disaster strikes. It begins with good operational practices, established dialogue between the organisation and its stakeholders. It begins with a willingness to understand the issues and concerns of all involved. It begins with healthy relationships at its heart. To set some context for our thinking, a word on what we do. It's always worth considering this because if we're to understand the issues, risks and complexities of organisational behaviour, We must be clear in our understanding of our role, the role of public relations in society today and society tomorrow. Public relations builds and sustains the relationships we need to maintain our licence to operate and is supported by good communication, behaviour and developed understanding. I've illustrated this for you here with my atom model of public relations, which shows how all the elements work together. Each relies on the other for success, and each revolves around the other in perpetual motion. At the heart of all we do is the relationship, and you can see here the relationship components of trust, satisfaction, loyalty, commitment and mutuality. These were identified by PR academics Grunig and Hon in their seminal paper of 1999, and they've been widely adopted, although I would always add the caveat that depending on the cultural setting, the relationship components may differ. For example, over the years, I've added reputation as a relationship component because relationships rarely progress if reputation is bad. That said, I believe that wherever we are in the world, the one relationship component consistent throughout all relationships is trust. The relationship is developed and supported by the electrons, the elements of communication, behaviour and understanding, each of which has its own elements. For example, understanding involves knowledge, empathy, narrative, the stories we tell, and attitude. Behaviour encompasses the way that we interact with our stakeholders, our organisational behaviour, values and actions, and how we relate to society, our social capital and societal contribution. In the coming months and years, restoring trust and confidence is going to be one of the greatest challenges we'll face at personal and organisational levels. And if behaviour is poor or perceived to be at odds with societal expectations, neither trust nor confidence nor a relationship will be forthcoming, regardless of whether we're pre, mid or post-crisis. I don't know if you've come across a lava lamp. There's one pictured here. They were very popular in the 1960s, colourful lamps filled with wax that, when heated, produce spheres that rise and fall, create patterns and structures until the heat's turned off. I always think of the work we do as being akin to a lava lamp. Before the heat's applied, the wax is at the bottom and nothing happens, but as soon as we apply any kind of heat, and for us that comes in the form of communication, interaction or engagement, and of course behaviours, things start to happen. The solid wax melts and spheres form, rising and falling depending on their reaction to the heat. Our communities work on a similar basis. Some will form as tiny bubbles, then they grow and form into bigger communities. As the heat increases or it cools down, they can all twist together and form a great big blob, generally around an issue, a risk or a crisis. And you'll find diverse communities coming together en masse to rally around one particular thing. We've seen this very recently with the Black Lives Matter movement, last year with the global school strikes for the environment, and given current world events, I'm convinced we'll see it again very soon, as people come together in an attempt to address the issues and inequities that they face or encounter. A favourite quote of Tim Marshall, one of the Public Relations Institute of New Zealand's life members, is that public relations operates where issues collide. When you're faced with different interest groups, different communities, different publics, and individually all of them believe themselves to be right about a particular issue, their perspectives on that issue collide and cause conflict, and often crisis will ensue. This can cause ethical dilemmas, and as Tim says, behaving ethically, doing the right thing, is easy when times are good. But when a crisis strikes, such as our current unprecedented times, or when you're under attack, or your organisation demands you do whatever it takes, those are things that we have to be prepared for. If relationships fail, reputation falters and licence to operate is withdrawn. Your reputation, the way you behave, will determine your future relationships and your ongoing licence to operate. Since the start of the pandemic, and before to be fair, many businesses and organisations, especially some large ones, have let themselves down badly by their behaviour. It's behaviour locked into the profit model of the last few centuries, refined in the latter half of the 20th century. But in chasing the dollar and being reckless with staff and stakeholder lives, they will have alienated their communities. And the result? They'll find their licence to operate revoked or curtailed when the crisis period is over and the true building of a new era begins. All your actions yesterday, today, and tomorrow should be driven by the simple question: is this the right thing to do? And are we doing the right thing because our intention is sound, or are we masking our actual intent with assumed behaviours? The way that you behave determines your future relationships, your licence to operate. Your ethical intent should be continually monitored and checked against your purpose and values. In behaving well, your ability to recover from a crisis is strengthened, as you can draw on the social capital, the good you will have earned as you recover. But fail to behave well, fail to communicate, if you demonstrate a lack of understanding of your stakeholders or an unwillingness to engage openly and honestly with them, the crisis will continue until recovery is impossible. There is a relentless unfolding of crises at present, all interlinked, and many resulting from issues that have been ignored or simply not dealt with. We flatten the curve of transmission in one place, then the curve of disaster peaks in another. A business may weather the difficulties of forced closure during lockdown, only to find their whole purpose and relevance has disappeared in the human search for essentials. They are in perpetual survival mode. A charity dedicated to helping others suddenly finds its funding and donations have disappeared overnight, as its supporters struggle to make ends meet and have no capacity to give more. The charity is in perpetual crisis. A government, anywhere in the world, seeking to flatten the curve. They should be in perpetual communication. So what role must we play as relationship builders, communicators, developers of trust? We need to start with our superpower, situational intelligence. I often compare situational intelligence to looking beyond the mountains, having a wide view of everything that's happening and everything that's going on, not just seeing what's in front of us. It's easy to focus only on the now, the moment, and the conditions that we're in at any given time, particularly if they're difficult conditions. But we must look beyond that, study what else is going on, observe change, emerging patterns and trends, and changes in societal norms. As part of our role, we must consider risk, analyse issues, undertake societal and cultural scans, so that we see what's happening in the world, as well as being aware of the general environment that we're all operating in. At this present moment in time, when strategies and plans are having to be reset daily, such observation, analysis, and interpretation is critical, because it gives our organisations insight and understanding of the backdrop against which they're operating. Clear identification and analysis of issues and risk are a crucial part of our work, helping organisations and their communities make sense of perpetual upheaval. Something to add to our analysis, and an area sorely neglected during crisis communication inside and outside the organisation, is the emotional state of stakeholders and the organisation itself. Alongside the many issues, risks that exist at this present moment in time, we must help people manage anxiety, fear, uncertainty, scarcity, all of which add new dimensions of risk to the mix. When we're talking about risk, it's often defined as a situation involving exposure to danger, and there's risk inherent in everything we do. But the aspect of risk that merits our focus is the definition of risk represented by the uncontrolled loss of something of value. Another interesting definition, certainly for our new era, is risk identified as the unintentional interaction with uncertainty, very much our collective experience these days. In assessing risk, we must be aware of physical exposure to danger, but from our professional perspective, identifying organisational value and the potential for loss in uncertainty is something that demands our attention and something that we are obliged to communicate once we've identified what's there to our leadership team. To give you an idea as to some of the additional aspects we must consider, here's an emotional response map that I put together to help clients and organisations consider their words, their language and their approach when it comes to navigating this period. The map gives examples of the types of emotions people were, and to some extent still are, feeling across the 4 principal areas of their lives: society, health, home and economy. And it matches each circumstance to the most likely emotion in that instance. That said, most people experienced all the emotions all at once, coping with peaks and troughs that are exhausting and in some cases debilitating. These emotional peaks and troughs are eased by community and organisational acts of kindness and compassion conducted within the current societal constraints. So when we saw images of our fellow humans singing from balconies, clapping those who are working so hard, keeping vital services going, it provides a necessary glimmer of hope. So the advice that we can give to our organisations before they say a word is read the room, and whatever the pressures, seek first to understand how your employees and communities are feeling, as that will determine absolutely how you'll be received. The Global Risks Report, published by the World Economic Forum, arrives every January, and for years the spread of infectious disease and the risk of pandemic has been in their top 5. This risk map extract is from their 2018 report. You'll see how risks are interconnected, and you can anticipate what might be ahead. Issues management anticipates. It's seeing beyond the mountains and understanding the effects. Ignore issues at your peril. It only takes a moment for an issue to transform into a risk and then to a crisis. The issue of disease transmission has existed for many years. It then became a risk, frequently highlighted by the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the World Economic Forum, and then it became a crisis: Ebola, SARS, and now COVID-19. Ignored, issues become bigger and far more difficult to manage, if they can be managed at all. By observing, interpreting, informing and taking wise decisions early on, we can help our organisations prepare and be ready. There are real and dangerous links between risks in our current global situation. We're experiencing the spread of infectious disease, and the pandemic is causing scarcity through curtailed production and supply. That connects to and leads to the very real risk of food crises, something consistently highlighted by the World Food Programme. Considering risks and issues is like setting up lines of dominoes in long runs. Once the line is set, only the slightest breeze or knock will topple them over. When you consider your organisation's scenarios, think about your domino line. What will have a knock-on effect? Highlight the risks and issues and communicate them effectively to your stakeholders inside and outside the organisation. All the risks, operational, financial, the full set, all feed into reputational risk. Identify the dots, look at how they join up, understand the relationships between each one and between your stakeholders, and, even if it seems completely improbable, create scenarios that you can look at and then assess the probability. What's the single knock that will bring everything tumbling down? Or where are the dominoes lined up right now, and are you going to trip over them? Which brings me to the changes I think we need to consider. Google crisis management and you'll find enough books and papers and blogs to fill several libraries. There's a vast range of material out there that tells you how to do crisis management. Good, solid, knowledgeable texts that provide templates, lists to check off, all sorts of advice and help. In today's world, though, such knowledge is not enough. We need to apply wisdom to help us navigate change and truly build trust. For example, I might know all the symptoms of COVID-19, have read all the leaflets and social posts. I know what to look for. I know I should wear a mask. But knowing isn't doing. Wisdom, the wise choice, applies context, perspective, and allows us to make sound judgments, like put on the mask and don't just talk about it. Much crisis management knowledge, centres around saving the organisational reputation, doing the least harm to the organisation's ability to continue with its licence to operate. Much of it, as with the profit model, is set in 20th century systems thinking. And I've highlighted here some examples for you that compare the knowledge that's given to us now with perhaps the wisdom we should be applying when it comes to communicating with our stakeholders, with our communities, and with those with whom our organisations are involved on a day-to-day basis during this ongoing crisis. When we think about the knowledge that we're given, some of these you'll recognise. When we're in a crisis situation, we should be providing answers, we should be accepting responsibility, we should have, before anything has happened, practiced our crisis plan, we should have identified the issues, regularly communicate, continually communicate, resolve some of the issues and problems, and express concern. Of course, apologising where necessary, unless, of course, it's a non-apology. But I'd ask you to re-examine all of the texts that you read or encounter when it comes to crisis communication and helping people to navigate through the incredible changes that we face every day at the moment and beyond this moment. So if we were to compare wisdom with knowledge, instead of providing answers, should we not be asking questions? Should we not be placing ourselves as advocates for those who can't ask the questions that need to be answered by our organisation? When we talk about accepting responsibility, if we've behaved well and if we continue to behave well, then the responsibility is always going to be ours, but we will have gained the trust of our stakeholders and built some social capital. Practicing the crisis plan, well, that's a luxury we can no longer afford. Essentially, we're living our crisis plan now on a daily basis. And that means that we must anticipate the issues, not simply identify them as they arrive. What's likely to happen? Where are we likely to have to go? Communicate, of course, but additionally collaborate. Involve your internal community with the decisions that have to be made. Do things together, create a story of together so that you can go forward and weather whatever is thrown at us in a way that brings an organisation together as a cohesive force. Resolving problems? Yes, of course. Intervening? Better. Stop the problems before they happen. Express concern? I would suggest demonstrate compassion. Understand the emotional situation of those with whom we engage. Understand the way that they're reacting to the crisis and to the circumstances that they find themselves in, and have the organisation respond accordingly. And that, of course, goes back to behaving well. How then should we communicate and build relationships with our employees, communities and stakeholders during a crisis? The answer is simple. Live through it with them. Be in the same boat. Look at the entire situation, not just from the organisation's perspective, which is traditionally how it's been done. Help the organisation, its employees and stakeholders to navigate the swelling waves of crisis that will continue to ebb and flow like the tides for many months to come. Perpetual communication, honest and transparent, continual listening, advocacy, compassion. These are your life rafts as the storm persists. Flexibility and adaptation, relevance and a willingness to change, those are your rudders. Use them to steer you away from the rocks. Gather knowledge. Look at the way things have been done before and understand why it's been done that way. But don't be bound by it. Use your imagination, expertise and creativity to find new ways to connect and cement your critical relationships in times of crisis. Be brave, be courageous, be capable, be communicative, and above all, be like Quinn, be wise. Thank you for listening, and when we begin our discussion, I very much look forward to hearing your thoughts.